this to the cloud. Okay, we are now recording our first ever Meadowbrook Wilson Reader Book Club Series meeting. Let's round of applause for everyone around the table. As you probably sense, this is something I've been very excited about. Not only because it gives me an excuse to read, it gives me an excuse to spend time with all of you beyond the wonderful objectives that we all do here at Meadowbrook, whether it be hosted touring or our guided house tours. Over the years, I've gotten the sense that many of our volunteers, we get to know each other in passing, right? Casually, on the floor. How are you? How have you been? Oh, gotta go to our post. Captain's Ralph is breathing down our neck. Gotta head out there. So one of our objectives is to find opportunities not only for appreciation, but for fellowship. And I'm hoping that the conversations around this table moving forward foster interest, as well as become a sort of long-term opportunity for us to explore important questions. Now, some of you might be wondering, although I sort of touched on this in the first issue of the Meadowbrook Gazette, the reason I thought a book club would be appropriate is because one of the things that seems to bring our Meadowbrook volunteers together, whether they be engineers or occupational therapists or master gardeners or corporate trainers or hospitality majors or lawyers. I mean, there's so many different backgrounds even around this table. Engineers, can't forget about them, nurses. Many of us are drawn to learning, and either the production and sharing of knowledge, or more selfishly, I suppose, just reading for pleasure, right? Learning about the world, learning through books, learning through conversation. So much of us have that in common. That's why many of us were drawn to Meadowbrook, myself included. Why did I become a docent 5 years ago while completing my degree in English at Wayne State? Because I like to tell stories, because I love history and local history. And that's why I wanted to start with a book like Lisette. It is a piece of local history with national reach, or as we'll probably hopefully talk about, international reach. And it is a book that I think would appeal to our beloved matriarch, Matilda Wilson. As you can see from the library that surrounds us, this family was well read, or at the very least was surrounded by books for reading. And they were a worldly family who explored not only this country, but many other countries around the world. We could spin that globe, which we will not do to curatorial policies, but we can imagine spinning that globe and finding Paris and where Lisette spent some time, finding Germany, etc. Although this isn't a book that Matilda necessarily read, I think it's a book that she would have enjoyed. And in my favorite section of our library here, and I hope to, with all of you, explore not only the fiction in this room, not these copies, but some of the nonfiction as well, our local history. So Early Days in Detroit by Friend Palmer. Palmer is a familiar name, I imagine, for those of us who live in Detroit. In maybe, hopefully, I don't know for sure, in reading that book on Palmer, I haven't read that issue myself, perhaps Matilda encountered the name Lisette, or at the very least, the name Brush, or the name Campow. For posterity. Thank you, Connie. Am I supposed to look or just point?
Yeah, so you can point at the books.
And actually, Burton, and the reason I also came over here, if you look here, these are some of the premier histories of Detroit by Burton. If you look at the secondary and primary sources noted in the appendices here, and also in the book, Burton comes up many times because Isabella Swan spent a great deal of time in the Burton Historical Collection, which although a beautiful space and a wonderful place that I know some of you around this table have been researching, it's very, they have one full-time archivist. This place is huge. They have one full-time archivist who's nearing retirement. She may have already retired. In the last conversation I had with her about 5 years ago, I was left with the impression that they weren't going to replace her with another full-time archivist. So you can imagine that all that knowledge, including the papers and the letters, the Williams papers, that are such an integral part of this text, although they won't necessarily be vulnerable, there might be challenges that are faced by that institution, from which Isabella Swan gleaned so much of the information that made this book a reality. Now with that, I mentioned to you that in this conversation, I have some questions that I'd like to bring to the table, but I do not mean to be the primary person filling this room with my voice. I do that a lot here. I do a lot of talking here in my trainings with all of you, but really, I want this, as I said, to be an opportunity for fellowship in which all of us can learn a little bit more about each other and more about each other's minds, right? How we engage with this text, which is how we refer to it in my English department, text, and what we learn personally about Lisette. To begin, before we dig into the text, though, I would love for us to go around the room and introduce ourselves. That way we're not shouting, you misread that page and misinterpreted Lisette's background. I'm, of course, pointing to you down across the table. That is Rick J. Rowe. But I guess I'll start with me. My name, for those of you who don't know, is Connor Newton. I'm the Visitor Services Manager here at Meadow Brook Hall. I've been here for about 5 years. I started as back then it was a museum assistant and a visitor services assistant. I worked as the interim visitor services manager for a time and have been a visitor services manager now for not quite a year. I started in August, so I still have a few months left to go. Of course, I'm honored to be here, as many of you sense. I had the rare privilege of getting a salaried full-time position at a place where I love to spend my time. Very rare privilege, and I don't take that honor lightly. And I'm very excited to be sharing this experience and further experiences of reading and learning with all of you, because as we all well know, from those of us who have interpreted Matilda and her story for years, she is someone whose one of her main passions was sharing knowledge and creating spaces by which you could accessibly and affordably share knowledge. I mean, they founded an affordable, or it was affordable, that's off the record, institution right here at this very table in 1957, where we're sitting today, what would become Open University. And I think that we are in that spirit every day, I hope living up to her expectations. Colleen, you want introducing yourself?
I'm Colleen Peters, volunteers in the house and also out in the gardens. And I'm Sue Tatro, not related to the J. Rose. But my husband's name is Rick. So
another parallel, my goodness.
And I'm a volunteer, a docent here, and a host at times.
Well, I'm Ralph Collins, and I'm
AKA Trouble.
Yeah, that's what a lot of people call me, especially if I'm against them. And I started here, I think it was 2011. It was with the Holiday Walk. I started in 2011, and it was under Bill Chakowski at the time. He was the captain, and when he sent me to lunch, I got lost.
We have space here.
Couldn't find my way around, but I've been a captain since 2012. I've been a Holiday Walk captain for, I think it's 4 or 5 years. I can't even remember right offhand. So you'll see me there, you see me at weddings. A lot of times in the summer, I'm up north and I'm not down here. I am a full-time licensed practicing attorney. I practice probate, estate, and financial planning. I'm also a licensed real estate broker, and also work for Dave Ramsey, and I'm the moderator of his website as well. So I got a pretty big and a lot on my plate.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
And I am Rick J. Rowe. I've been volunteering here for 6 years now. I'm a docent. I work in the gardens and square. I'm retired, except I live for Sue.
So I'm Sue Giro. Let's see, I've been a docent also for about 6 years. And I have my own business and I do a lot of corporate training.
I'm
Sue.
Barnes and I'm new.
Yes.
So, and I work part-time at Hanson's Running Shop in California. And I own my own business. It's a running and walking training program.
I'm Barbara and I'm a brand new volunteer. I'm Natasha Jones. I'm a printer by day. I like to do pottery and volunteer here. That's my target for pottery and here by shovel to your docent. A lot of my experiences during COVID, so I don't have much.
But we're getting
I'm Marianne Schaufer, and I also am a new volunteer. I'm excited to be here.
Well, one of the things that so excited me about, honestly, full disclosure, oh, Joan. Yeah, Joan. Last, certainly not least, former Meadowbrook Garden Club president. Joan, please introduce yourself.
Yes, when I retired from teaching 20 years ago, I came over to Meadowbrook during the holiday walk to learn how to make a live greens centerpiece that would last from November to February for one of the fabulous people in the garden club. And then I was asked, did you want to join the garden club? So 20 years later, my garden was Pegasus and moved on up. And yes, I was president of the garden club for 5 years. And then also in recent years until the pandemic, I volunteered for Holiday Walk, usually on the Friday, which I loved, and also introduced my grandchildren to this wonderful place. So nice to see you all and glad that we could get together on this occasion.
Thank you, Joan. Sorry, I almost cut you off there. I'm glad I caught myself there. But one of the things that I was so excited about by the response, honestly, I was hoping maybe to get one or two people around this table. And there were obviously quite a few more than that, and not only that, familiar faces and newer faces, which is very exciting to me, so that we can get to know each other a little bit more and engage with this important work. Right off the bat, I wanted to just talk briefly about my impression of this book. It's not exactly riveting, right? I acknowledge that. It is an exploration of primary resources, primary texts to help illuminate a marginal figure in Detroit history. As you sense, and as this book acknowledges, there is a dearth of documentation that gives us a clear sense of Lisette's voice. Many of you around this table with whom I speak about books, the kind of nonfiction and fiction we're drawn to is not necessarily thrilling, but it's the kind that brings history alive, narrative history. Although this book in a way in the 1960s predates that movement in American historiography, right? Now, the kind of history that you read that's published by university presses as well as popular presses, it's designed to almost read like a thriller, right? It grabs you, it holds on to you, it colors scenes vividly. Using the language and the resources that we have about the time. This book is full of silences. And I actually am interested over the course of this conversation to hear from all of you about your impression of these silences and also your impression of the book. I'm somebody who really enjoys reading primary documentation. I'm the kind of person who spends hours and hours scanning early 20th century Flemish language newspaper copy, page after page after page. So I kind of like that sort of thing. But a lot of other people may not, right? And some of you around this table may not have enjoyed necessarily reading this book. And if you didn't, I'd like to not only hear why, but sort of also get at what you did enjoy, what you learned through reading this book. Before I get into some of my questions, I would love to open the floor and engage with that question of reader response. What was your takeaway in terms of your experience of this as art, as an aesthetic, as an experience? Did you enjoy it? Did you find it rewarding? Did you find it at times, even though short in length, maybe somewhat agonizing? That's not the term I would use, but I can understand. I have some friends who don't really read history like this. They're drawn to narrative fiction, who might not have enjoyed this book, especially not if it had been 350 pages. That might have been a bit too tedious. It's like one of my favorite works is the history of the Catholic Church in Detroit, published by Wayne State University Press in the 1960s, 70s. That's this, but at like 400, 500 pages.
Oh.
Right? So it's so rich in facts, it's so rich in content, gleaned from church archives and the Burton Historical Collection and the Bentley and the William Clemens Library at the University of Michigan, just full of that. But it isn't exactly riveting. So rather than going around, I'd like to open up the floor sort of Socratically to hear a little bit about your impression of this book, your impression of Swan's writing, and your experience of reading this 1960s era historical text. Did you enjoy it? Did you not enjoy reading it? And if so, why? Please, thank you, Rick.
Yeah, it's not the style of book that I like to read, and I'm glad it was this short. I read, books by recent books about government officials that are similar to this, and it just goes on and on about this meeting or that meeting, and I have to put them away after halfway.
Yeah.
I just can't do it. I really like historical fiction. I like to learn about the history that I'm not aware of in a story format. That's what I like to read. So it wasn't my best, but it was a really easy read, so I could do it. That wasn't a problem. But to be quite honest, when I got done reading it, I didn't want to read it 2 times to really fully understand it. But I'm not sure that she ever did not become a slave. And I wondered, in a historical standpoint, how is that possible? Was she not? And maybe I missed it, but I just thought that she always was owned by somebody. And I don't get them,
And that's actually one of and this is in the question of silence, which is something, and it's a very common theme in English studies as well as history, historical studies, around questions of slavery. So much of what we do, there's a beautiful book by Sadie Hartman that was recently published, and it's what's called the speculative history. It's not about the history of enslavement, it's about the history of precariously employed Black women who work in different industries that would be considered maybe marginal. So they can't speak to us. Oh, Joan, are you still with us?
Yes, I'm looking up a source, so
great.
just give me a minute.
Gotcha. There's so much they can't say to us because we don't have their letters. So what Sadie Hartman does is she speculates in a way that Swan does very sparingly, very sparingly. She doesn't, there are a few moments in which I know she is, not guessing is not the right word, but she is speculating what Isabella felt, because we don't know what Isabella felt about it, except through the lens of those writing about her, the people who employed her or the people who owned her. And to that point, Rick, my impression was it's a little cloudy because the history of enslavement in Detroit, in what was Upper Canada, what would be today Quebec, if not for the Revolution, or most likely Quebec, or Ontario, eventually it would become Ontario, it's murky because the law and is murky on it too. As you probably noticed, or one of my favorite moments as somebody who's interested in legal history and indeed considered becoming a lawyer, still do on occasion, is there was a moment, the very judge, Woodward, right? And I want to talk about names today, who deny Lisette her freedom would also establish case law that would facilitate freedom later on, right? That just goes to show how murky and how ambiguous the questions of freedom and what that means are. And my rule of thumb, this is as an interpreter here, like all of you, a lot of, and this is as having spent 5 years in the academy, a lot of my colleagues are very quick to demonize the past. Right? That's the language that they use. And I always hold in my mind the phrase from Marilyn Robinson, one of my favorite writers: history cannot be demonology. Right? You need to approach these people through context, right? With a fair lens. I think everyone around this table can agree slavery is bad. Right? And many people in the 19th century, and many people in the 18th century agreed, including the people who enslaved. They agreed it was bad. The reason I bring that up is because one of my favorite, and I brought it today just because I was sort of reviewing before this conversation, one of my favorite recent histories, one that I think those who are interested in narrative history, who are interested in this subject, who felt like they may have not gotten a full, exciting experience from it. So this is called Landowner Detroit by Miles. She was worked in the Department of History at University of Michigan before she was poached by Harvard, because Harvard does it all the time. They get all their great faculty from the University of Michigan and other great public universities, take them away. They can offer them things these public universities can't. One of her primary texts or secondary texts that she pulls from extensively is this book by Isabella Swan, right? Lisette and the story of her family, the Fords, is prominently featured here. And why is it prominently featured here? Because this is an archaeology, as it were, of the history of enslavement in Michigan. When I was growing up, and indeed as an enthusiast of the Civil War, we were the land of freedom, right? We fought the South, who enslaved people. 10,000 Michiganders died of disease or in battle during the war, the greatest war we ever fought, which was against itself. Michigan didn't do that. And then in reading this book and in reading Lisette, you're confronted with the fact that no one's innocent, right? And the reason I'm getting into that is because although there was a history of enslavement that was murky in this region, there weren't that many slaves in Detroit, even at the height of enslavement in the early 1800s, late 1700s. I doubt it ever exceeded 1,000 persons, probably harder. I believe there was one, I think it was in the 1830 census, I can't remember, maybe one enslaved person in Oakland County, who I think may have been the only recorded enslaved person in the history of this county. So although it wasn't a substantial number of enslaved persons, so I'm not trying to attack Michigan, our beautiful state, as a territory, as a state, for that practice, it did happen here. And I guess to get back to your point, Rick, and your impression that you were left with a sense of confusion and lack of clarity, did other people feel like the question of slavery was not really concretely addressed and or tackled? And if so, could you say more about your experience related to that question? So we know, because of the framing of this text, the paratext, we know that from the introductions and the introduction or description of Isabella Swan that we get, we know Lisette was an enslaved person. We see it on the cover. She's a remarkable trailblazer, right? She overcame adversity. But in the text itself, do we feel that resolve? Do we have a great deal of clarity about what her life as an enslaved person was? I don't think so. What do you all think?
I don't think that, this is Joan speaking. I don't think
Yes.
that wasn't the purpose of the book. It was to explain that this, where blacks or people of color came after the Civil War. But when you're talking about experiences, I belong to the Clarkston genealogy group, and we had the honor last Thursday to hear from a woman by the name of Carol Bachak Egbo, who's the Oakland County Parks historian.
Love
And I
her.
think she also teaches classes at Oakland University.
Mhm.
But anyway, she's a wonderful storyteller. And so she gave us a whole talk on the reason she got into this was somebody gave her the job of discovering who were the original property owners of the parks that we have in Oakland County. And what her group, what she came up with was this was quite an abolitionist area. And the reason for that is because at the time, Canada was owned by Great Britain, and Great Britain had told the world they no longer believed in slavery. So that's why it was important for enslaved people to try and get on the Underground Railroad, which went to Detroit so they could go across the river. Also, another area that they went to, I didn't know what was California. So perhaps the goal of this particular book was to show that with encouragement and trust in a new system in this country, all people of all colors could make it, could do well in the American dream.
I think that's a really useful point, Joan, and I appreciate you bringing it up. We know the primary subject of this book. It is Lisette. The pieces, of course, we get of her. And, is slavery, based on its presence in the text, how frequently encounter it, it's not exactly a main character, is it? Hardly at all. At this point, we get very little of that concretely. If there was a main character besides Lisette, besides not a non-human character, what would that character be? I mean, one that comes to mind for me is we are experiencing Lisette's through the voices of those who employed her exploration of the world. At a time when the world was becoming open to Americans in a transformative way. One of my favorite sections of this book was when they were in Europe, primarily because when I think of the 1850s and 1860s in Europe, many of us might not think of this because when we think of pre-Civil War, we think about American farms. We think about people going to church, maybe not leaving 100 miles from the same place their entire lives, right? Well, not millions, thousands of Americans, especially in Boston and New York, a robust middle class, a merchant class, a professional class, would have had the means to go abroad. And thousands of the dead. One of my favorite is Herman Melville. He spent a lot of time, he wasn't especially wealthy, he spent a lot of time traveling abroad, right? And where do you go when you're traveling abroad? The same places Lisette, at the same time. So when they're talking about going to Italy, I'm getting excited because there are great Americans who were in Italy at the same time. Why do you go to Italy? And I wish we had a sense of this. Why would you go to Italy in the 1850s and 60s as an American, as a wealthy American, or as an American artist? What draws you to Italy? It's not the pasta, although the pasta is great. What is it?
It's the art.
The art, right? You can't go on Google. You can't go into this library and pull a book on English heraldry and English portraiture and a book on Van Dyck from the wall, although they had very big libraries, certainly. In order to get virtual reality, you had to go where it was real. You had to go to the galleries. You had to go and see the ruins. We spent a lot of time talking about the neoclassical style in this house, right? In Matilda's study, in the Christopher Wren dining room. That's where the neoclassical is rooted, right? In exploring the ruins of a Roman and Greek past, which thousands of Americans and Englishmen did in the 1850s and 60s, and Lisette was among them. For me, that is one of my favorite characters. So the experience of the Lisette, which is, remember, this is speculative on my part. I don't know what Lisette thought of Paris. I know she made some mean buckwheat cookies. I know that. And let me tell you, the first thing I thought when I read that was, I'm gluten free and I can eat buckwheat. So I was like, give me that recipe. I gotta find that recipe. What for you do you think would be a main character in this book besides Lisette? A main impression that you're left with. It's not, slavery is an impression, but it's not a main impression. It's not the main impression that we're left with, to Rick's point. For Joan, it was a reminder, and this is her projecting on it, which I think is very appropriate, about the American dream is possible for so many, including somebody who began a slave. What was it for you?
I think it was relationships, because she had that was highlighted quite a bit with these families she worked for, the children that she enjoyed taking care of because she couldn't and didn't have her own children, her own family, and her relationship with God. You know, that was all interwoven, which ended up being the last big point.
Literally,
At the
I found it.
At the end, and the relationships and how what people thought of her, that was clear. That I was so thrilled to see how admired she was,
Yes.
how smart she was, with probably no education. She learned a little French, it said.
But she was fully illiterate, which is
Okay.
remarkable.
They wrote about the fact that she kind of held Mrs. Biddle together,
Yeah.
which is kind of cute. And so anyway, she was very well thought of, and that was pretty great.
I love that description because for me, when I close my eyes and think about my experience of reading this book and revisiting, as I was sitting here, I was sort of going through some of the pages again and rereading a bit. I was also drawn to relationships, and in this room in particular, I can't help but think about Matilda too, right? And was that your impression, Colleen? You were you reading Matilda into this book?
Yes.
How so? Could you
And
say more about
then I
that?
think about Matilda and Mary, was that her?
Yes,
I think about that relationship, and it was so important to her.
absolutely. And it was so meaning in the way we interpret it, right? I mean, so for those of you, Matilda hired a mixed race woman, a black woman, as her lady's maid, Mary Matthews, for many years. And we locate in that gesture indication that Matilda not necessarily was ahead of her time, although she certainly was, but that she judged people on the basis of character, not on the basis of their skin. And I say that coming from a family where I know there was racial prejudice, you know, and many of you, I mean, we live with it to this day. It's quite common. A lot of those rooted in our lived experiences, which I don't mean to diminish or minimize. Matilda lived in a time where the standard was prejudice. That was the standard. That's just the way things were, you know. And if you and I spent a lot of time in newspapers and newspaper readings. If you look at the editorial pages of our greatest papers, who were they maligning? Martin Luther King. You know, they were maligning Stokely Carmichael, which I can understand why, but they considered them instigators of violence and terror, right? And in the last 50 years, who unites our country now? Who does probably 90% of Americans, I haven't seen the most recent polling, consider an American hero who brought this country together and is deserving of a giant statue done by a Chinese sculptor in the National Mall? It's Martin Luther King, right? So things have been transformed there. I was thinking of Mary Matthews too, and how Matilda leaned on her, to Sue's point, relied on her, especially in moments of profound loss. And for me, that opened up a question, and I'd love to hear from all of you about it. I am personally very skeptical of things that are good for me that I have to pay for. By that, I mean, I am personally very skeptical of going to therapy, going to psychiatrists, even going to a doctor, right? The term I hear, and I learned this in philosophy at OCC 7 or 8 years ago, interested party. It's a part of my nature. I see interested party whenever I'm writing a check. And I recognize that's flawed, right? That is a personal issue of mine, right? That it's hard for me to be vulnerable with somebody I'm paying to be, listen to me be vulnerable, or listen to my body be vulnerable. And I know for a fact that doctors have my best interest, especially the doctor who, with his prescription, is making my life much better. What does it mean when these relationships that probably meant to Lisette more than anything in her life involved pain? Or, and this is a possibility too, although it's not quite clear for us, involved her relationship with her enslavers. What does that mean? I mean, she said Willie, her favorite, right? Willie's her boss. Willie's family is her employer. They can release her, right? She is at their mercy. And yet, it means so much to her. We don't know for sure, but that is our impression. That's what I felt. Does that make them any less meaningful for either party? What did you feel
Well,
about the
if I may,
Oh, go ahead, Joan.
if I may say something. Okay, if I may say something, if you think about Civil War before the war and so forth, with slavery, these were the places where they ended up after they were purchased were the only places they knew of as home to survive. So if they became a lady's maid or the nanny or in the household of the plantation, they became a part of a family. And as this lady said in this speech on Friday, a lot of them have the same last name as the owner of the plantation. So, and then also one of the things we learned was what happened after the war, that Black people finally became people. Because if you look at the census, according to this lady, most slaves are not listed by their name, even the common name that they had in the household. They would say like a Black male, 10 years old, or a female, 15 years old, or grandmother. So they're always listed under the most census, especially like in Europe. And if you were part of a castle community, whatever, you were always listed if you were part of the help underneath the owner of that particular property instead of in a town by yourself. So when we think about the Civil War and where it led most of America, there are always going to be sides of this. And I think that she became, Lisette was an outstanding figure because no matter who she was with, she always made friends. I know that she loved Paris by the looks of that outfit. So,
I love that, Joan.
so perhaps coming back to America, I don't know that she really was interested in one way or another, but the point of this whole book is that here is in my view, by reading the last few pages, was especially when you see that church on Grosse Hill, the small chapel, that this was her place that she spent her money on so that all people of all colors would have a place to go and worship. Because if you look at the early days of Grosse Hill, like you were saying, it was so far to drive to something. And that was her purpose in life, that she could see that the church would play an interesting part in most people's lives.
And I think Sue touched on that as well, Joan. We can't diminish the importance of faith at this time in America, right? One of my favorite misconceptions about early America, specifically the period of the Revolution, is that it was a very religious time. It was not. George Washington did not take the sacrament. He actually refused to eat of the flesh of Christ. He would not take communion. He attended mass. He attended church, right, as a good Anglican and eventually Episcopalian. But he did not join his wife and her children in partaking of that. Many other founding fathers did. John Adams was very devout, but many people at the time, they were distant from the church. And in the 18th and 17th centuries, there was actually a great deal of difficulty among faith leaders to draw people into the church. You saw that similar challenge in the late 18th century and in the very early 19th century. But then something happened, a great awakening, right? You saw that in the late 1700s. You saw it in the 19th century. And one of the greatest periods of awakening was between the 1820s and the 1850s, right? A time of revival in upstate New York, where people by the hundreds and thousands, like in the 1950s, some people here, not necessarily around this table, but at Meadowbrook, might have memories of tent revivals, right? This is where tent revivals began, where people were drawn to newfound American faiths. Mormonism comes to mind. Probably one of the most American religions around. Even you may not necessarily believe in it, right? Certainly, I'm not a Mormon, but it is an indigenous religion, which isn't to say that there aren't indigenous religions here attributed to the indigenous people of the North America. The reason I bring that up is Lisette was born in a time and spent years in faith, and her faith is probably one of the most important impressions that we got from the story. That was also a very important part of my reading experience. Did anyone else around this table feel drawn to that aspect of her story? The fact that she gave everything pretty much to establish a church. I'd love to get to the point in my life where I have enough money to build something like a church. I don't know if I'd ever had the capital for that, but she was able to do that.
Or a chapel.
Or a chapel. There's a
Start small.
distinction.
Start small.
Exactly. That's an important distinction. Every
Every turn.
turn.
A woman of faith just to get through life like that. You should be so trusting and.
Yeah. And you're right. And like we were talking about. So, what does being smart mean? You know, I mean, my grandpa, small businessman, contractor, you know, work skilled trades, came up from Arkansas and, you know, 28, 29. He didn't have a middle school education. He stopped schooling in elementary school, and yet he paid for a house, paid for the lives of 4 children. You know, I am where I am because of my grandpa Ralph. He read the newspaper every day, but he didn't go to high school. He was closer to Matilda, except he had less education than Matilda Wilson, who graduated with an 8th grade degree. Was my grandpa smart? Yeah. Was Matilda Wilson smart? Heck yeah. Was Lisette smart? Sue agrees. You know,
I would also
What do
say
you think,
she's
Mary?
very savvy.
yeah. How say more about that? That's very-
Well, you know, you talk about trust, and I think, of course, there's that, and that goes both ways in a relationship. But she also knew how to, I don't want to say necessarily take advantage, but build on relationships to be able to maybe grow or obtain what she wanted, or for herself or for others. I just think she was very savvy. There has to be that element in a person.
Yes. I think I really appreciate that word because it's savvy. I mean, not only was she savvy in the kitchen, right? But she could navigate.
Cut those cookies.
Yeah, I know that every just thank good. I mean, this is sort of not necessarily morbid, but if she was a bad cook, what would we have? You know, I mean, would they write about that? Maybe they wouldn't, you know, if she was a bad cook. I mean, she was savvy in the kitchen, and something that's great about the dawn of the Detroit, which is a social history and in a lot of ways an economic history. And it gets into it in a lot more detail. Tia Miles really, and actually I wanted to pull up a section that I thought was very useful in thinking about the question of savviness and specifically labor. So, and I know you don't, I meant to make a copy of this so that you could read the language, but I'll just read some of these sections. One of the things that she talks about is one of my favorite poems by Philip Levine. It's called What Work Is. And that poem engages with the question of defining what work is. And he's a factory worker. He's somebody I feel, he ended up in an academic, he died in California. He got his start at Wayne State University, where he first taught, studied English, right, while working in a factory. And he went from working in a factory on the line to being a poet and teacher, right? Being a poet and a teacher, that's work. It's very different work than working in a factory. It's funny, I was just talking with my boss, Shannon Oberski today, and one of my colleagues, Claire. The work I do, I consider it work, but I'm not digging ditches with grandpa like my dad did every summer. The hardest work, my uncle always says, the hardest, you don't know what work is until you dug ditches with grandpa. I'll never have the chance. He died in 1995. So it's, but one of the things that Tia Miles does is she talks about the work that that Lisette did, right? And that work tells us a story. That work, it tells us something. One of the sections, and let me see if I can find it here. So this is about, so this is a quote from Askin, one of the characters that we employed in the whole of the winter nights for herself and brother. This is describing what Lisette was doing for herself and her brother. And this is actually, this is different from what we've seen. This is a quote of frustration. This is a quote describing Lisette working for herself during a period in which she was employed. Employed in the whole of the winter nights for herself and brother without permission, having refused to twist worsted kind of yarn, saying she must mend her brother's clothes, which time must be nearly 3 hours every night in the winter. She's spending 3 hours every night in the winter doing work for her and her brother, not doing work for me. Although John and Archange Askin wanted Lisette to spend time making the tightly twisted worsted yarn that the family could use herself. This is the family who employed her. They wanted this product, this commodity they could sell. They found that Lisette, quote, has only spun or twisted yarn 3 times this winter, though frequently desired to do so, end quote. During the cold winter months when days were short in the Great Lakes, Lisette was spending every evening as she chose, helping her brother, or at least that is what she told the Askins. Lisette possessed 3 quite valuable skills that she must have learned in apprenticeship to her mother, Hannah. She could spin. She could sew. And this is one we all know. She could also bake. Recognizing that her specialized labor was prized enough that she would not be let go by the Askins, even if they grew frustrated with her, Lisette controlled her own productivity. The reason I was drawn to that in reading this is we were talking about relationships and how all her relationships seem positive, right? In a positive light. Here we are seeing Lisette being savvy as ever, flexing her power as a producer of a desired commodity. She had the savvy, an illiterate woman, to use her skills to leverage her employment. And I was thinking about it's a different Lisette. That Lisette, according to a different audience, you might read her as a manipulator, right? As wicked, right? That's not a good worker. But at the same time, we see these relationships with Willie and the baking. You know, maybe she preferred baking over spinning. But I thought that was an interesting tension that emerged for me. I understand this is an outside text, but it was something that I thought was intriguing. Yeah. But the reason I got into that, like defining what work is, defining what smart is. I guess, do we all feel like Lisette was an intelligent person? And if so, what other moments of intelligence that aren't book smart did you locate in this text that you found particularly interesting? Additionally, outside of the question of intelligence, think about the question of feeling. Right? Where did you feel like you knew Lisette best? Sue felt like she knew Lisette best in the relationship she had that were described in these letters that we had from the Biddle family. Were there other moments like that you locate in your reading that made you feel like you knew Lisette a bit more? Or, as a counter, were there moments in which you wish there was more because there was so much lacking?
You know,
I had a thought about the baking.
Oh,
A baking is usually done in a central kitchen area with people coming and going. And baking could be an opportunity, no matter what your level of education, that you could share ideas or hear ideas, or possibly learn about different, like the trips and what was all involved in that. And I thought it was very gracious of the person who owned her or she worked for, that she wrote those letters of concern about her all the time. So I think no matter where she was, the baking brought her in to be a part of another family.
yeah. And like the Brush family, the Biddle family was obviously cared deeply about Lisette. I'm sorry, Sue, you were going to
you know,
share a
you were
thought.
talking about this idea of being smart.
Yes.
You know, they say your IQ is your capacity to learn. And I think she had a huge capacity to learn,
Yeah.
whether she had formal education or not. She definitely had curiosity in that. That was cool.
Yeah. Yeah. Despite the challenges she
Yeah.
faced.
Mentoring she had to, for investments.
That,
Huge one.
great point.
Yeah.
Can you say more about that, Kelly, in your sense of, my favorite investment of hers was in steamship. Of course, this was in the early days of railroad expansion. So by the 1890s and early 1900s, most of this state, when you were traveling, you shifted away from the river, which was my favorite image of Detroit is of Detroit on the river. And if you look at our renderings of Detroit from 1701 to maybe 1826, you are looking at Detroit from the river, because that is how you came to Detroit. It was by water. It was through the Erie Canal when it was completed. It was on the lakes. It was by schooner. It was by sail. It was by steamship. What happens? The railroad. Right? And the way we inhabit space and explore space is different. One of my favorite moments of investment was the steamship. I don't know how good an investment it was, but did you have a favorite investment, Colleen, in particular? Or is there more that you'd like to say about what that mentorship may have meant to her and what it means to this story?
Well, I can't imagine there were a lot of employers that chose to mentor their
Yeah.
African relationships. And one thing for me, I'm disappointed that there aren't more pictures. I would love to have seen more pictures. I kept staring at this picture. And
Yeah.
she has such an angelic face. She looks so sweet.
I think there's a little bit of a financial contradiction though, because she invests and she acquires the funds for the bequests and whatnot, but she's in Paris buying clothes, and the Biddles have to make sure she has enough money for the time when they go to Italy. So if she's savvy financially, or to use a word that we haven't applied to her, is she manipulative with the Biddles with the income she's making, because she acquires the bequests. But on the other hand, I think there's one point Mrs. Biddle has to, she asks Willie to give her additional funds because she's been buying so many clothes and whatnot.
Yeah.
There. So isn't there a bit of a contradiction?
It could be.
Last time I was in Paris, I couldn't resist the dress either.
That's a great, so I guess that's a very interesting point, and an interesting tension that it creates. It's like, are you a bad person fundamentally if you manipulate? We manipulate every day. It's about navigating relationship. Manipulation might be too harsh a word. Yeah, like leverage. I often use the term leverage. Even that is cold and calculated.
But my question is she
actually financially responsible?
Or is she
Intelligently?
Yes, it's
Yeah.
a question.
And
Because she does have all of these
Absolutely.
funds, but yet the Biddles are concerned about her
Because she's cash
financing
poor
it.
in Europe.
Exactly, because
Mhm.
she's cash poor. So those are two sides of the coin.
And
Who's the real
yeah, and
Lisette?
yes, who's the real Lisette? And which is a big question in a lot of ways. Who's the real Lisette?
And yet she's acquired. And another contradiction
He
is
just wants
they're
something done.
concerned about her when they go to Italy, being alone in her room,
Yes.
not knowing the language, and
People are
yet
gonna
she's
steal it.
quite,
Steal it.
quite astute in her life and her family and whatnot, which I see as yet another contradiction. So I had more questions about who is Lisette after
If only we had.
Lisette.
I love it. If only, and that's one of the things, and that's, I guess, why I was reflecting on this current movement in historiography towards speculative history. For so long, what was history? It's what you can read in a contract, it's what you can read in a will. That is history, right? And yet, if we rely on that being history alone, we lose a lot. We lose a lot at Meadowbrook. So much of our institutional knowledge comes from anecdote, right? It comes from living history that is passed down to us through the voices of Richard Wilson, Barbara Wilson, right? Through the clippings in newspapers. Another question about, we talked about what work is, what smarts is, what history is, right? This is a history that doesn't speculate, that doesn't lean into the questions that we desperately want answered. One of the few moments where she does do this, and there were a few moments where I underlined language in which I know Isabella is going out on a limb, really going out on a limb. Where there is, let me find it here. Huh. Well, I just saw a line from a letter that really stuck out with me as I'm going. Lisette is very anxious to hear some news from her Detroit friends, especially her cow. That is, here it is, on page 32 of Lisette. This was an illustration of Lisette's time in Paris, in France. On a stroll along the Seine across the bridge to the Isle de la Cite, I'm sorry, my French is terrible, she often visited Notre Dame. Leaving the cathedral, she was no doubt fascinated by the flower market, which was open twice a week. There is a doubt there. That is speculative. This is Swan giving us a taste of conjecture. She is giving us her interpretation of what Lisette must have felt, because any reasonable person at the time who knew Paris, who knew that space outside Notre Dame, who knew that space along the river where vendors stand, would have felt, right? We don't know that for a fact. There were probably opportunities for her to speculate more. And right now in historical writing, there's a lot more of that speculation, right? We're inviting that kind of speculation. Why? Because it makes history more riveting. And also, more importantly, because it allows us to explore questions of history that are not legible in the historical record. Joan made a great point of talking about not only a lecture from Carol Lobo, but what it meant, what the Civil War meant to this country, right? Not only was it the greatest war this nation ever fought against itself, so many dead that are accumulated dead from all the other wars of this country combined have not yet met that number. But it also created a statistical imagination that gave us data sets from which we can tell stories. Not only that, it made it such that African American people and indigenous people and people who are not otherwise legible in the historical record outside of wills and contracts are now legible in the census. Right? No longer are we cataloging property, but we're cataloging human beings. That data tells us a story. The question of silences, the question of who Lisette is, that's probably a character in this book itself, right?
Well, I have a question and it goes along, are you Joan? No, you're Barb.
Barbara, yes.
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 About just this, unsure of who she is.
Yeah.
And they're on page, and I didn't understand this, on page 39 at the bottom.
Mhm.
We're talking about Lisette and hoping that, they get little Susie out in the fresh air. And they said, probably at the end of that, I'm very glad to hear that Susie was getting air in her little sleigh. She will have to be too delicate if kept too much housed, especially if Lisette keeps her in the kitchen where she herself delights to be, as she is like all colored people, somewhat of a salamander.
Haha.
And see, that's the changeableness. But why salamander being in the kitchen? She likes to be in the kitchen, but maybe outside too? I mean, I don't know if anyone else had an idea.
Actually, while you guys discuss, and that was something I flagged, but I forgot to look it up in the OED. That could be a moment, not necessarily of prejudice, but of stereotyping. The terms we use, a lot of times, especially in the American South, when we refer to the enslaved person who works in the domestic sphere or enslaved women, they're described as lascivious, right? They are scheming, they are looking to manipulate our men for sexual means. That is the language in which many African American women are presented in the context, in the imagination of certain slaveholders. So I wonder if salamander, and like I said, I'll have to look at the movie, is a way of not necessarily disparagingly describing Lisette and Black people, but a way of describing her or Black people per se's behavior. So I guess my question for you, this is what we do in English, is what is a salamander literally? They change,
Depending
they're
on
also-
their environment.
yes, they change colors. They change colors, but they're also a rather slow amphibian. Is that correct? Are they fast? Are they slow? How do they move?
They were pretty fast.
They hop.
I
Okay,
got
like a
one
frog.
that got away in our home.
Mhm. Yeah.
And she made her way all the way, sheared all the way down to the sub pump.
Yeah.
So they're also smart.
Yeah.
So that's right. So a salamander who change now, like the question of manipulation, this is it bad for the salamander? Like, and there are two ways to look at this. She is describing her as a salamander, somebody who is looking on these two colored women, to use the term of the day, endearingly. Also, potentially with a tinge, she's a bit patronizing too. I don't know if you read that into that tone. She's a salamander.
I don't know if I would read it that way, or it's more of a compliment to her
Okay.
that Lisette was able to read her her different roles
And
or
what
her
the need is.
approaches,
Yeah.
that she's intelligent enough. I mean, this was my take. I was
Mhm.
positive
Yes.
that she's giving Lisette. That's not the same, right? It's just my impression that it's almost like a compliment that Lisette is savvy enough to
Mhm.
read who she has.
Yeah.
Yes, how she had to adapt and respond.
Yeah.
One way
You
to
adapt
Willie,
to your own
another way-
surroundings, with
Yeah.
the term of salamander, they change color and change
Yeah.
things with their surroundings, and that's what she did.
And
It also says that it represents immortality, rebirth, passion, and the ability to withstand flames.
Mhm.
That's what a salamander is also.
Yeah. Oh, and yep, a spirit supposed to live in fire. A woman who lives chastely in the midst of temptations. That was in the 18th century. A soldier who exposes himself to fire in battle. That was 19th century. it was used up into 1897. A fire-eating juggler. An iron poker used red hot for lighting a pipe, igniting gunpowder. So we can just open a powder keg, y'all. Or a can of worms, right?
But don't you think at that time, it was probably more the salamanders on the rocks or in the garden or something, changing colors to make themselves camouflage?
Yes.
Yeah, or useful,
Mhm.
yeah.
Yeah.
I think of it more.
She read the room.
And all of us around this table, in saying it and talking it through, sense that that's a good thing, right? She's diplomatic, and yet,
I think it shows intelligence.
it does, but then you also have to remember the American conversation, especially at this time, questions of chivalry and backbone. This country, especially at the time, valued making a stand. Drawing a line in the sand and not crossing it, even if it meant your own life, right? Thousands of men did that, right? Robert E. Lee believed in the Union. He fought for the federal government his whole life. And he drew a line in the sand and said, I don't care about that anymore. I'm going to stand with my state. I'm not going to compromise. I'm going to stand with my state. Even though they very well lose, even though my state of Virginia is not prepared, knowing what I know about the federal government, to win this battle. You know, he was not a salamander. Well, he was if we interpret the gunpowder version of salamander, facing battle with like a fire-breathing dragon. You have to remember, salamander, I think, also at times refers to a dragon in the past, like salamander. So I guess it depends on who's reading it. I think being diplomatic is a positive trait, right? And when we talk about politicians today, it's like, have some backbone, stand for something, make up your mind. You go in one room and say something, you go in the next room, you go from a union meeting to a chamber of commerce meeting, and the conversation completely changes, right? I guess it depends on the point of view. I happen, and I feel like this room thinks it's a positive characterization. Yeah, it's a very interesting characterization. Did anyone have something more they wanted to say on that question?
Yeah, I did. Yeah.
About the question of, well, salamander, but the question of manipulation, the question of who Lisette is. Because I'd love to talk about that more, but there is one big question that I really wanted to touch on, and I realize we're coming near the end of our time, which is shocking to me, but delightful. To go back to the question of place, right? We are in a place, a National Historic Landmark, that has a name tied to a brook that has been dry for goodness knows how long. And there are other places named Meadowbrook. We have a Meadowbrook substation of the Rochester Hills Fire Department. There are Meadowbrook shopping plazas. Some of those may have been inspired by Meadowbrook Hall itself. Some of them might have held on to that place name before. The name has meaning, right? Wilson Hall, the campus of Michigan State University, that has meaning. Dodge Hall, right? All of these places have meaning to us. And yet, so many of the places that we drive every day, that we explore every day, have no meaning at all. It's a street. It's only a street. Compound is only a street, right? Rush Park is only a neighborhood. Woodward is only M1. I found myself in this book being awakened a little bit more, reminded by what place is. And I wanted to hear from all of you a little bit about if you sense that, if you felt closer to what it means to live in Detroit, what it means to understand where place names come from. And as an end note to that, to contextualize that question. The reason I think it's important, the reason why I'm interested in that question is because there is a bit of a controversy about some of these names, right? Around the question of indigenous history and the history of enslavement. There are many people in this country, many of whom I respect, who believe in tearing these things down, who believe in removing the statue of Lewis Cass from the United States Senate, who believe in wiping Macomb off the face of the map because of Macomb's history.
I have a thought on that.
Yes, Joan, please.
Being a person who loves history and genealogy and that, these are all part of the past, yes, but the past is what makes the future. And when you can see those statues and they bring up conversations about what people thought at the time, I think that sometime in present day, we miss the good things that people actually did for this country, that started this country. Like my grandparents came here in 1843 from northeastern corner of Germany, because there was one, you've talked about church, there was considered to be the one Lutheran church was the state church of Germany. And if you didn't agree with that, you couldn't go to school, you couldn't work, you couldn't do anything. So the people who came here originally had very good intentions and worked to get away from things of the past, whatever. It's unfortunate that one group came here and were the victims of slavery in their own country as well as here. But we also, to me today, we don't talk about it, there is just as much, if not more, slavery in the world today, the whole world, white, brown, or children or whatever, than there's ever been, because it's something that people don't want to talk about. But to me, I have to look at George Washington as a person who thought enough of this country to fight for freedom in the American way. This is the only place in the world that there is the freedom that we have today. And if we don't look at the past and the mistakes that we made and look to what we can do for all people in the future, I believe we're doomed.
I really appreciate that point, Joan, and the importance of remembering. So much of what we do here and what I believe in is remembering honestly, right? And that requires us to look at the past and all its horror and all its beauty, and to hold both of those things in our hands at the same time. Not everyone's willing to do that. I do want to point out, although, and I have read this statistic and it's very true and it's horrifying, with the increase of population and the increase of economic precarity in the world, there are more people technically in bondage of some kind, in involuntary servitude than ever before. However, chattel slavery, as it existed in the United States, is a fundamentally unique institution in its horror. I am very interested in the primary texts as well as the media that has come from explorations of the subject. Solomon Northrop's book, 12 Years a Slave, is a remarkable, remarkable history that I would encourage everyone to read, because in a very fair and interesting way, he approaches the question of what slavery is. And what slavery is an American paradox, right? It was an engine that created American prosperity. It was an engine that created moments of tenderness and care between people who enslaved and those who were enslaved. It was an economic proposition and relationship that literally killed people before they were 40 years old, because each time they met a certain quota, the very limit of their physical capabilities, the foreman, whose job it was to increase productivity, would increase the quota each time. Each time you go to the scale away, goes up. Each time you go to the scale away. What I'm saying is it was an engine of terrible violence that was unique. Although some would say, and it's important to remember, what happened in Brazil was also uniquely terrible too. Their form of chattel slavery was quite vicious, and it went on into the 1880s, far exceeding or surpassing the American history of slavery. But to take the main point of what you were saying, Joan, and I think it's very important, do you think these place names should change? Do you think the people we learn about in this book, who made choices that to many of us today are seemingly undesirable, but were choices of their time. If not erased, what else should we do? It brings me to the conversation we're having about our visitor center, right? One of the panels that's going to be really important in my mind, my estimation, is one of the first panels that we'll have. And that is talking about the land. What is this land that Meadowbrook is situated in? We know it as Meadowbrook Farm, right? We know it as 350 to 1,500 acres of American farmland that was purchased by Dodge, by the Wilsons. But what was it before that? Right? This was Anishinaabe land. This was land that was held by indigenous people. In a way, and this is sort of an act of good fortune, there was not terrible violence that occurred here on this land. There was not terrible violence that occurred in Oakland County. If you go down to Detroit, there was some violence. I know some of you, Colleen, you've spent some time in some great cemeteries, mainly Elmwood, right, which is the site of the Bloody Run, right, and terrible violence from the War of 1812, which Lisette is old enough to remember, right? The reason I bring that up is, as an institution, we're reflecting on what this place, this land was. And as a university, there's actually a stretch of land now on campus, not on East Campus, but near main campus, that will be designated as a space for indigenous people. I don't know, and the institution doesn't know yet what that land will be. It might be a place for some sort of memorialization. That's why I bring this question up. What do you do about
if I could add one more thing that we learned from the speaker on Friday, indigenous people did not sell the land because they looked at the land as belonging to everyone. So when you look at the county records in that, especially for Oakland County, it has the names of the people, whether it was US government or whatever, that took it over, but didn't pay for it. And then the other thing is, my ancestors lived in town of Wheatfield, which is outside of Niagara Falls. And the Erie Barge Canal, like you said, played a very important part. And if you remember, Michigan was a territory, of course, before it became a state. And it became a state because the abolitionists wanted another state added to the list of non-slavery states. So along the Erie Barge Canal, after the little white block buildings or wooden buildings were used by the men who dug the Erie Barge Canal to live in, those became buildings where US government land sellers would come in and they would sell people who were interested in moving to Michigan, like we have Holly, New York, Holly, Michigan, etc. They would sell 200 acres of land to people who were interested in the abolitionist thinking in America.
Well, that's a great point. And we know what a contract is now, but when you're an Anishinaabe person, you know,
right,
for the Iroquois Confederacy, you know, you might have a translator, and that's one of the things I love too about it. This book talks about translation, right? The work of translation between indigenous people and settlers, right? At a time when that still meant something, when it was before the treaties that make up this space came to be. Was there something that you learned or that you took away from the question of place and names, right? One of the details that I linger on is that Lisette didn't just go by Lisette or Elizabeth. Did anyone catch another term of endearment? L-E-T-T-E.
oh yes.
The question of names, like what names are, what they mean, what they tell us. Was there a name that struck you from this story, tied to a county or road that you found yourself lingering on or that you were intrigued by? I, of course, saw Compow, I saw Woodward. Sibley. What struck you about that?
Well, then I knew that I'd seen that name a
Yeah.
lot, and I go by the house all the time.
Yep.
In fact, I would have taken a picture of that, but there was too much traffic.
The Biddle House is another house that is
Right.
right there on Jefferson. And that's the other thing. The way we envision space is totally different. I mean, she was on the outskirts of Detroit on Monroe Street, which is now the heart of Detroit, right? Charles Trowbridge, who was a friend of hers, somebody I researched, his house, which was built in 1826, is the oldest extant house in Wayne County. Right there on Jefferson. It's a law office. I've not been able to go inside it. Across the street from the Charles Trowbridge house is the Biddle house. All these.
And
names-
And,
Oh, yes.
and then I was just gonna say, when you got out here to Oakland County, I found out in the genealogy group that the roads were named by who had the largest farm on the road.
Yes. Oh, that's so, and that's, I guess for me, that's a takeaway, Joan. It's as you leave this place today, as you drive around, I mean, I'm thinking about place names in Detroit differently. Well, what about near your house in your county, where your family grew up? It's something to think about.
Well, I think that's, you talked about the place of names and all this. To me, that was one of the most interesting things about the book.
Yeah.
Was hearing all these names. And I was like, oh, well, I didn't know that's what they did, or I didn't know that's where that came from. And it made me actually go to research some of them to find out what it all meant. And then to add to that, that's why I think it's so important that we not just erase these. I don't think we should use today's lens, and I know that other people have said this, to judge what happened in the past. Yeah, so I think that's very important. And talking about my own personal experience too, I found out that where I live, the name, so many of the streets are farms and homesteads that people had, back in the day.
That's such a good point.
I don't know if I'm gonna explain this the right way, but I recently moved here from the East Coast. So all of the names in here, I haven't visited these places. I don't know what they are. And I think back to all my decades on the East Coast from Boston down through New Jersey. And you know it like this and take it for granted. And it's such a good thing at my age to have all of this to discover, which I think is really exciting. Like I can't visually, ask me something about Manhattan and I can visualize it like that. I don't know what Woodward Avenue.
What's Woodward?
What is
what's
this? Who
Macomb
does it
County?
belong to? I don't know any of the history. And it's so nice to be able to learn something new after I learn all your driving laws. Way different.
Oh, yeah.
Like, did you see the left turn?
Making you turn left on red lights, you don't do this in metropolitan area in the East Coast. no.
Colleen, you were going.
I do.
I was gonna say I was disappointed that I'd never heard of her before. And I worked in an African-centric environment. We had to learn African history and never heard of it.
Yeah.
And then, so I visited, did Claire? pick-
So you.
Oh, did she take, oh, she didn't print it out.
No, so there were some pictures that before we close, that Colleen was doing some exploring, and I hope this is a perfect segue.
We're not gonna pass the phone around, are we?
No, it's on my phone.
Oh, okay.
So, and with the power of technology, and Joan, I don't think in the moment, since we don't have much time, I'll be able to, but I'll show you on another occasion some of these images and can describe them for you. These are, and I think this is one, are you talking about the gravesite? Yes. So,
And the historical plaque.
yes,
Oh,
yes. So these, and we're gonna lose you for just a moment, Joan.
Okay.
As I switch to HDMI.
So I'll just say, I went to Oak Hill Cemetery to see the something about her, anything about her, and found a big historical Michigan plaque there that gives a little bit of the history of her. This, and that street in the cemetery is named after her.
And for those who, I'm
Yeah,
sorry.
go ahead, read it.
So in 1825, Elizabeth Dennison, quote, a woman of color, unquote, purchased 48 acres of land from Pontiac's founder, Stephen Mack, agent of the Pontiac Company. They were surveyors who split up the county for sale. She became Pontiac's first Black property owner, but never lived on the property. She was a land speculator. In 1827, she and her husband, Scipio IV, this is always a source of confusion for me, leased the land to her brother, Scipio Dennison. In 1836 and 1837, Mrs. Forth sold the land for $930. Elizabeth Dennison was born in the 1780s as a slave in present-day Macomb County. In 1807, she fled to Canada, returning to Detroit around 1812 as a free woman. At her death in 1866, she donated money used toward the construction of St. James Episcopal Chapel on Grosse Ile. She is buried in Detroit's Elmwood Cemetery. Part of Oak Hill Cemetery now occupies Elizabeth Dennison Forth's property. Now, for those of you from the East Coast who are unfamiliar, not at the heart of Pontiac, at the outskirts of Pontiac, and what is known as University Drive, that goes on to M59. That's an M59 on-ramp. It splits Oak Hill Cemetery from the older section, which is the oldest cemetery in Oakland County, and the newer section, where many of the great Oakland County figures are buried, including General Richardson, for whom Camp Richardson is named. He was a famous Civil War general.
Now, is that the same cemetery where you did,
Yes.
is it reenactment? Is that correct?
Yes. So I am on, thank you for bringing that. I am on the board of directors of the Oakland County Pioneer Historical Society, and we collaborate with the Oak Hill Cemetery folks for a cemetery walk to fundraise to maintain this cemetery, on which, and thank you for reminding me, Colleen, on which Elizabeth Dennison Forth's land was situated.
Have a date this year for the tours yet?
They are in September. So I'll share that in our enrichment materials when the time comes. This is Elizabeth Dennison Forth Drive. Right.
Oh, thanks for going and getting that.
Yeah, no
Wow.
kidding.
It was
And
scary.
here,
It was pouring rain.
and this relates, and Joan, what I'm showing now, in addition to the historic Michigan plaque, and in addition to the street name sort of in Oak Hill Cemetery, here is two modern markers memorializing her.
But that's in.
This is in Elmwood.
Elmwood.
Okay, so
This is in Detroit.
she very
This is in
likely
Detroit. Okay.
she very likely had, and Elmwood is the oldest cemetery in Detroit. Of course, we all know Woodlawn, or many of you will come to know Woodlawn. That is where the Dodge Mausoleum is. That is where the Dodge family is buried. This is Elmwood, which is not far from Jefferson, near Belle Isle. And for those who can't read it, Joan, it says Elizabeth Dennison Forth. Again, this is a modern tombstone, 1793 to 1866. 2 years before Horace Dodge was born and 2 years after John Dodge was born. Lisette gained freedom from slavery by escaping to Canada with family. Returning, she became a longtime domestic caretaker. I emphasize care there. Investor, Colleen, you called it, stockholder, and the first Black female landowner in Michigan. Founder of St. James Episcopal Church, Elizabeth Dennison Forth, emancipated 1807, died August 7, 1866, age 114. So the work of history is ongoing. I know Isabella Swan would be horrified by that number, right? She died in her 90s. One of the interesting things about that plaque, though, and I meant to tell you this, Colleen, is that her year of emancipation, according to this may or may not be accurate, is listed on her tombstone. It's as important as the day she was born, the year she died, right? And this is actually a perfect segue. Next month, we'll be talking about Frederick Douglass's, the most recent biography of Frederick Douglass, which is a remarkable work written by David Blight, who has Michigan roots. He was educated in Flint, went to Michigan State University, and is now a Harvard man. In a way, his life began, and he talks about his awakening when he was freed. And in a way, there are resonances between Lisette, Frederick Douglass, and I can sense, or I believe that in a space like this, Matilda, I think, would have been very interested in their story of perseverance, because in so many respects, she really embodied a similar spirit, right? Overcoming loss, overcoming trial, overcoming humble beginnings to become the remarkable woman who we interpret at Meadowbrook today. I know we could probably, oh, go ahead.
I just wanted to point out,
Yes.
she is wearing her Paris.
Yes,
Yeah.
isn't she? I'm so glad she got them because she gave us that interesting photo as a result. But I want to thank you all so much for making time to join us today for this wonderful conversation. I'm sure so many of us could continue talking about this remarkable book. Of course, I want the conversation to be ongoing. So as we leave this room, when you're on the floor here in the interpreting, when you happen to cross paths at events, feel free to return to these moments of reflection. I hope this conversation doesn't end, and I hope you all have a safe drive home, and I look forward to seeing you again soon. Thank you.
Thank
For
you.
supporting us.
Connell.
Thank you so much, Joan, for joining us virtually.
Thank you. Bye-bye. Have a good evening.
Okay.
Okay, I was just gonna say that for anybody who goes to the Indian Village to